In 10 days, Donald Trump is boarding Air Force One to Beijing. It's official. He's meeting Xi Jinping on May 14th and 15th. The White House is calling it a trade reset. China is calling it a new era. But here's what both sides aren't saying out loud. China just enacted new trade rules that alarmed every U.S. business operating in their country. The same week, they announced this peace summit, a handshake in public, a trap in the fine print. I'm going to show you the 3 clauses in this deal that will directly affect every dollar in your pocket. If you've never heard of China's new Decree 834 and Decree 835, 2 regulations signed into law on April 7th and April 13th, 2026, with 0 transition period and immediate effect. Subscribe right now because what Beijing just quietly put into law while the diplomatic pleasantries were being exchanged will be the most consequential fine print of this entire summit. Hit the bell, drop a comment. Do you think Trump is walking into Beijing with real leverage, or is he walking into a setup? I want to know what you think. Now let's get into the numbers. First, let's establish the actual power structure going into this summit, because the mainstream narrative of a balanced negotiation between 2 equals is not supported by the data. Trump is visiting Beijing on May 14th. For the first time, a U.S. president has set foot on Chinese soil in nearly a decade. The last visit was Trump himself in 2017. Weeks after that trip, he launched a trade war. Beijing remembered. And for the past year, Xi Jinping has been methodically building leverage for exactly this moment. The bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China represents close to $600 billion in annual trade. American companies have over $250 billion in direct investment inside China. And Beijing has spent the last 18 months identifying every single choke point in that relationship and turning it into a weapon. The Busan meeting in October 2025 proved the strategy works. In that meeting, China paused rare earth export controls, agreed to purchase 25 million metric tons of American soybeans annually through 2028, and made commitments on fentanyl. The U.S. in exchange cut tariffs and signaled loosening of restrictions on Nvidia chip sales to China. Analysts at Piper Sandler called it directly. China is getting the better of the U.S. in these negotiations. Wolf. Researchers Tobin Marcus told clients, Beijing successfully used rare earth export controls in a soybean embargo to force Washington to lower tariffs. That is the baseline. That is where the negotiating table sits when Trump lands on May 14th. Now here's the clause that nobody in the financial media is connecting to this summit loudly enough. On April 7th, 2026, 6 weeks before Trump's Beijing visit, China's State Council published Decree 834, the regulations on industrial and supply chain security. It took effect immediately. No transition period, no grace period, no warning. This regulation does something that has never been done before in Chinese law. It elevates supply chain decisions made by foreign companies into matters of national security. But what does that mean in practice? It means that if a U.S. company operating in China conducts an ESG audit, a supply chain due diligence review, a forced labor compliance check as required by U.S. law, that activity can now be treated by Chinese regulators as a violation of Chinese national security regulations. Article 13 of Decree 834 explicitly prohibits supply chain information collection within China that violates state provisions. The language is deliberately broad. It does not define terms. It gives regulators maximum interpretive latitude. Every American multinational, Apple, General Motors, Boeing, every retailer with Chinese suppliers now operates under a framework where complying with U.S. law could simultaneously put them in violation of Chinese law. That is not a theoretical risk. That is the current legal environment as of April 7th, 2026. Stay locked in because Clause 2 is the one that carries personal criminal liability. And this is where it stops being a corporate compliance issue and starts being a direct threat to individual Americans working in China. 6 days after Decree 834, on April 13th, 2026, China's Premier League signed Decree 835, the regulations on countering foreign, improper extraterritorial jurisdiction. Also immediate effect, no grace period. This decree formally codifies what lawyers are calling the malicious entity list, a new designation tool that goes far beyond the existing unreliable entity list. Entities placed on this malicious entity list face asset freezes, entry bans, cancellation of work and residency permits, prohibitions on all transactions with Chinese entities, and restrictions on data transfer. But here is what makes this different from everything that came before. Article 12 of Decree 835 introduces the possibility of criminal liability for individuals, not just companies, individual managers, individual executives, Americans working inside China for U.S. multinationals. The standard for being placed on this list is whether an entity promotes or participates in implementing foreign measures that China considers improper extraterritorial jurisdiction. In plain language, if your company complies with a U.S. sanction, follows a U.S. export control, or cuts ties with a Chinese entity because a U.S. law requires it, China can now designate you personally as a malicious actor. China's UEL enforcement went from 3 designations in 2024 to 67 in 2025 alone. The enforcement machinery is already operational. Decree 835 just gave it criminal teeth. Now connect this directly to what is at stake in the Beijing summit, because this is where it gets financially critical for every American. China controls 60% of global rare earth mining and approximately 90% of processing capacity. Every semiconductor, every electric vehicle battery, every missile guidance system, every AI chip powering the data centers that run the American economy, all of it runs through materials that China processes. Beijing demonstrated in October 2025 that it will use that control as a weapon, announcing sweeping export controls on rare earths, gallium, germanium, antimony, and graphite that sent shockwaves through every defense contractor and technology company in America. The U.S. cut tariffs, the U.S. blinked, and the deal that came out of Busan was framed as a 1-year pause, a general license covering exports of those materials. The critical word there is general license. According to supply chain compliance experts, a general license can be revoked at any time. Today's relief can vanish tomorrow. Beijing structured the agreement to maintain maximum optionality for itself while requiring concrete, lasting concessions from Washington. And now Trump is flying to Beijing to negotiate the next chapter of this arrangement, carrying a trade deficit of over $270 billion. Technology sector entirely dependent on Chinese processed materials, and 2 new Chinese laws that have put every American company operating in China on legal notice simultaneously. Here is the financial number that frames the entire leverage calculation. The U.S. trade deficit with China was $295 billion in 2024, the largest bilateral trade deficit America runs with any country on earth. American farmers depend on Chinese soybean purchases that represent roughly 60% of total U.S. soybean export volume, when China is buying at full capacity. American technology companies, Apple alone generates roughly 20% of its global revenue from China. Boeing has outstanding orders from Chinese airlines worth tens of billions of dollars that have been deliberately stalled by Beijing as a pressure tool. Jinping walked into every previous negotiation knowing exactly which levers caused the most political pain inside the United States. Soybean prices hurt rural states Trump needs to win. Boeing job losses hit swing state manufacturing communities. Apple stock movement hits retirement portfolios across the country. Beijing has mapped American political geography onto its trade strategy with surgical precision. And the third clause, the one that will most directly reshape your money after May 14th, involves semiconductors and what Trump may be forced to give Beijing in return for the rare earth commitment being made permanent. Nvidia is the most consequential variable in this negotiation, and it connects everything from your investment portfolio to America's long-term technological competitiveness. At the Busan summit, Trump signaled that Washington would act only as a referee in conversations between Chinese officials and Nvidia, a statement that hinted strongly at a loosening of semiconductor export restrictions. Beijing's explicit demand going into the Beijing summit is access to advanced AI chips. China's 15th five-year plan, finalized just days before the Busan meeting, explicitly centers self-reliance in high-level science and technology as its top national priority. If Trump gives ground on semiconductor export restrictions to secure a rare earth deal that is only temporarily enforceable anyway, America trades a permanent strategic advantage for a revocable promise. Let's pick up exactly where that Nvidia thread ends, because this is the single most financially consequential variable heading into May 14th, and it connects your investment portfolio, America's long-term technological dominance, and the price of every device you own into one negotiating room in Beijing. At the Busan Summit in October 2025, Trump told reporters aboard Air Force One that he discussed Nvidia chip exports with Xi Jinping. His exact framing was, "It's really between China and Nvidia, but we're sort of the arbitrator." That statement, unpacked by every serious analyst who studied it, signaled a potential loosening of advanced semiconductor export restrictions to China. On January 14, 2026, the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on semiconductor imports, including Nvidia's H200 AI processors produced in Taiwan, but simultaneously revised the Commerce Department's licensing policy to allow H200 chips to be sold to approved commercial customers in China on a case-by-case basis. Nvidia applauded the decision publicly. Jensen Huang has been pressing the administration to loosen controls. The commercial logic is simple. China represents an enormous potential market for Nvidia's hardware. The strategic logic going the other direction is equally simple. Advanced AI chips are the most critical tool in the technological competition between the United States and China for the next 30 years. Giving China access to H200 class processing power is not a trade concession. It is a strategic transfer. And Beijing is going to push hard in Beijing on May 14th to make that transfer permanent and expand it to Blackwell-class chips, which were explicitly excluded from the Busan discussions. Now here is the financial reality that directly hits every American investor before a single deal is signed. The U.S. trade deficit with China stood at $295 billion in 2024. That number is structural. It is not primarily a function of tariff levels. It is a function of where global manufacturing capacity lives and how deeply American supply chains are embedded in Chinese production infrastructure. Apple manufactures over 90% of its iPhones in China. American retailers from Walmart to Target source the majority of their consumer goods from Chinese factories. The tariffs that Trump has applied and then paused, adjusted, and renegotiated multiple times have not fundamentally altered that supply chain geography. What they have done is create a persistent layer of cost uncertainty that American businesses have absorbed in one of two ways. They pass it to consumers, which is inflationary, or they absorb it in margins, which is deflationary for corporate earnings. Either outcome hits the American household higher prices at checkout or lower returns in the retirement account. There's no third option while the trade war remains unresolved. This is the moment that separates a real deal from another rolling truce, and the distinction matters enormously for your money. Former U.S. Ambassador to China Nicholas Burns described the Busan Agreement as an uneasy truce in a long, still simmering trade war. Piper Sandler analyst Andy Lear told clients directly, Beijing had made the same promises on soybeans and fentanyl during Trump's first term and failed to fully deliver. His conclusion was unambiguous. It is doubtful Trump received anything structural in return for lowering tariffs. Brookings Institution analyst who studied the pattern of 4 separate U.S.-China trusses negotiated in Geneva, London, Madrid, and Busan in a single year, concluded that each agreement left enough ambiguity that both sides could claim victory publicly and make mischief privately in the implementation. The word they used to describe the cumulative result was more commotion than motion. That pattern is the baseline against which the May 14th Beijing summit must be evaluated. Xi Jinping has pre-scheduled the entire arc of 2026. Trump visits Beijing in May. Xi potentially visits the U.S. for the G20 in December. Beijing has boxed Washington into a calendar that gives China maximum time to press for concessions at each stage while controlling the staging and optics of every interaction. And here is the piece of this picture that should concern every American watching their savings, their job market, and their technology sector simultaneously. China's 15th five-year plan, finalized just before the Busan meeting, set self-reliance in high-level science and technology as its explicit top priority for 2026 through 2030. Beijing is not negotiating to become more dependent on American technology. It is negotiating to buy time. Time to build domestic alternatives to Nvidia chips. Time to develop indigenous rare earth processing alternatives that reduce its own exposure to American counterpressure. Time to secure its overseas economic interests. While Washington is distracted by the Iran war, Brookings scholar Patricia Kim stated it precisely. The United States and China each command chokeholds over critical sectors of the global economy, and neither side is prepared to relinquish them. Atlantic Council senior fellow Melanie Hart went further. There is no indication the U.S. side has the same strategic clarity that Beijing brings to these negotiations. China knows exactly what it wants from May 14th. It is known for months. The question is whether Washington has a comparable level of preparation. So what does all of this mean for your money? Specifically, concretely, right now. 3 direct financial consequences flow from what happens in Beijing on May 14th. First, rare earth supply chain risk remains the most immediate. China's general licenses covering gallium, germanium, antimony, and graphite exports to the U.S. are revocable at any time. Every American company in the defense, semiconductor, electric vehicle, and clean energy sector is operating on a foundation that Beijing can destabilize within 24 hours of any policy reversal until the U.S. builds domestic processing capacity, which Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has initiated, but which takes years to scale. This vulnerability is structural and permanent regardless of what agreement emerges from the summit. Second, if Nvidia chip access is meaningfully expanded to China as part of the Beijing deal, the immediate stock market reaction may be positive for Nvidia and U.S. tech broadly. But the medium-term consequence, Chinese AI capability advancing faster because of access to American hardware, carries national security and economic competitiveness implications that markets will not price correctly in the short term. The strategic cost will be paid over years, not days. Third, the 2 Chinese decrees signed in April 2026, Decree 834 and Decree 835, remain in full legal force regardless of what diplomatic language emerges from May 14th. Every U.S. multinational operating in China still faces the compliance trap those regulations created, caught between U.S. law requirements and Chinese national security regulations that directly conflict. That legal environment will not be resolved by a presidential handshake. It requires detailed regulatory negotiation at a level that summits do not produce. American companies operating in China, and by extension the American workers, shareholders, and pension funds connected to those companies, are living inside that legal conflict right now with no clear resolution timeline. The Beijing summit on May 14th is not a ceremony. It is not theater. The financial stakes are real, measurable, and already embedded in your supply chains, your investment portfolio, and the technology infrastructure your economy runs on. A handshake in public does not rewrite the fine print. And the fine print, Decree 834, Decree 835, revocable rare earth licenses and semiconductor access traded for strategic concessions, is exactly where the money either stays safe or gets quietly redistributed away from the American side of the table. If this analysis gave you something your financial newsfeed skipped entirely, subscribe right now. Share this with someone who thinks the Beijing summit is just diplomacy. It is not. It is the most consequential financial negotiation of 2026, and you needed to understand it before May 14th.